Hello, everybody. Generally speaking, the UN mandated security missions are controlled by the group of 5 nations of the United Nations Security Council and is less likely to follow the interests of any one party. Since it is controlled by 15-member Security Council and the intentionally diverse United Nations Secretariat. Historically, there are two countering blocks that are seen in the UNSC, that is the US, France, and UK, and the other one being Russia and China, that can use their veto in deployment of the mission, which translates into inaction on the world's most urgent crisis at times. Until today, Russia has vetoed on 13 decisions and US has vetoed on whopping 79 decisions, beating the Charter of Global Peace and Harmony that the UNSC should stand for. For all these years, there have been 263 vetoes to stop the resolution passed in the General Assembly since 1946. The politics of the council also contort the mandates themselves, as comprise it's always required, and the danger for the council is mudding of political objective, as the obfuscation of the political objective leads to ambiguity in the mandate. These politics also trickle down in the deployment phase and show up as a normative, operational, or enforceable ambiguities that correlate between process performance and outcomes in the principles of UN peacekeeping operations. Hi, I am Vipul Tamhane, and today on Diplomacy Direct, to discuss this less talked operational subject, we have alphabetically General Apurva Bardalai and Ambassador Srivastava. Major General Dr. Apurva Bardalai has served distinctively for 36 years in the Indian Army, with field exposures with the management of UN peacekeeping operations, as well as the Army HQ level decisions making for the Indian peacekeeping efforts. He has served with the United Nations peacekeeping forces as a military observer in Angola during the peacekeeping and the peak of the intrastate conflict, as the deputy head of the mission and deputy force commander of United Nations interim force in Lebanon, the UNIFIL. Currently, he is a distinguished fellow of the United Services of India, USI, New Delhi. General Bardalai brings insights on strategic perceptions of the dynamics of conflict environment and the complex challenges of the UN peacekeeping operations, from forming workable solutions for cessation of hostility and bring sustainable peace by coordinating multifarious mission activities with available resources at hand and mandate orders to follow. So welcome to Diplomacy Direct, General Bardalai.
Thank you.
We also have Ambassador Dinkar Srivastava, who was Indian ambassador to Iran and led the negotiations on Indian participation in Chabar port. In his almost 4 decades of service in Indian Foreign Services, he has also served as Indian ambassador to the Czech Republic, Libya, and India's High Commissioner to Malta. He has dealt with UN peacekeeping as director and joint secretary UN in Ministry of External Affairs for 8 years. After retirement, he served as senior advisor to ONGC Videsh Limited. He is a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation. He also served as advisor and board of several entities like GAIL, India Ports Global Limited, etc. He is well known as an author of the book Forgotten Kashmir, the other side of the line of control, the book that talks on the POK and Gilgit-Baltistan. So welcome to Diplomacy Direct, Ambassador Srivastava.
Thank you.
So at the onset, today we will discuss these said ambiguities in the indeterminate operative norms between alternative interpretations of field peace operations in several UN peacekeeping field operations as we speak. And these operations that actually make defining and assessing the UN's performance from time to time as a problematic issue in terms of the discoursing actions of the peacekeeping forces. Also, while we researched for this session, we reviewed the Gunther and Thompson's framework for international organization performance, the IOP research to UN peacekeeping. The observations in peacekeeping operations are found to be irreducibly ambiguous, and this is exactly what we are going to take up in today's conversation. Uh, so, General Bardalai sir, there are several noteworthy instances in history where UN missions have failed without any permanent resolution. Lot to do with its operational inefficiencies, like UN MOGIP in Kashmir, uh, the dispute since 1970s, the Cambodian genocide, the Somali conflict since early 90s, the Rwandan civil war of 1994, the 1995 ethnic cleansing of Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Darfur conflict in Sudan since 2003, atrocities on Syrians by Bashar al-Assad for more than a decade now, and then the Rohingya crisis, and the list is too long to continue with. So now that you have been the boots on ground commander for Indian peacekeeping operations and have faced these situations firsthand, what can you account as major factors that led to the mission failures from time to time, the mandate failures from time to time due to fundamental operational ambiguities and otherwise? And so that is, the missions were basically set for failures, and where does the world draw a line to the operational incompetencies of UN to bring justice to their own charter in these regions? General Bardalai sir.
Okay. Vipul, I think you have raised a very, very relevant question. Despite the long history, UN peacekeeping operations are often criticized because of its past failures, mostly generally what you referred as genocide in Rwanda, Somalia, and Yugoslavia, etc. But less talked about for its contribution towards the conflict management. There could be a number of reasons for this. One is that many scholars and academicians prefer to highlight only negative points. On the contrary, a recent meta study, which took place about 2 to 3 years back, they surveyed, researched about number of several missions, and they have concluded that UN peacekeeping has made positive contributions towards peace, reducing bloodshed, and also sustainable peace. Now, that apart, now there could be a number of reasons why a peacekeeping mission may succeed or fail. I mean, a list is very long. It could be strategic reasons, it could be operationals, or it could be tactical reasons. I mean, it can range from, like, for instance, political divide in Security Council for not being able to take the decision, lack of a peace agreement, absence of a peace agreement. If the peace agreement does not take place, actually the initial commitment is not there. Or I would say lack of the budgetary support. Or there are times that what Brahimi has brought out, there could be peacekeeping missions itself could be lacking on its own part. Normally they say that the weak mandate, ill-equipped peacekeepers, ill-trained peacekeepers, when the list can be very long. Well, these are fine, but there could be some regions or causes which are beyond the control of the peacekeepers. So it will be very unfair always to blame the peacekeeping missions for what they could not achieve. And besides, there is no standard yardstick how to judge a success or failure of a peacekeeping operations. Academicians, scholars have tried their best. There is no single standard, evaluation framework that you can judge a peacekeeping mission. That apart, it's fair to say that it has been seen more often than not what happened that when even peacekeeping operations, when they get deployed, they're expected to follow or adhere to the UN norms. Now, the list of norms, UN norms, again, can include adhering to the principle of peacekeeping, good conduct and behavior on part of the peacekeepers, respect to human rights, gender sensitivity, and also respect to the environment. And the list can be very long. While all these elements are very simple to quantify, when it comes to the UN norms of adhering to peacekeeping principles, this is very difficult because the huge gap between the concept and the theories and what is practiced on ground. Now, peacekeeping principles itself are not mentioned anywhere else in the UN Charter. These have been derived from, the second Secretary General of United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, from his report to the General Assembly, is called Summary of the Report Post-Event Operation in Gaza. So basically, three principles came out. One is the consent, second is the impartiality, and third is the use of force. To tell you briefly, consent means what he said was basically from his experience. When his UN General Assembly sanctioned or authorized that peacekeeping operation in Gaza, it did not give out in a strategy. So his strategy was left to the Secretary General. So he formed the strategy. Essentially, the three elements which were there is that peacekeeping operation should take place with the consent of the host government. That is a basic use of the consent came. Second, it should be impartial, or say that firstly, any troops from the P5 members of Security Council would not take part, or any other country which can have any strategic or geographical interest in the area of the conflict. Third is that the use of force, only minimum use of force as a last resort to be used. Now, the three principles actually later form to be part of the cardinal principle, also known as Holy Trinity in the subsequent peacekeeping operations. But it is ambiguous because not been defined properly, and I can discuss all these three issues separately, as if you allow me to do it now, or I can go subsequently. But
So
point is that
the Holy Trinity always being no population go extinct, everyone will live in harmony and no competition within the environment.
yeah, there is another angle to it.
Uh-huh.
So I would say that this is one of the norms, ambiguity even norms, along with that attended other norms, use of force comes the responsibility to protect, protects of the civilian. The number of norms are there, very, very become controversial. And member states, they try to interpret these norms and principles as would suit them. So if you look at the past even peacekeeping operations and some of the current contemporary peacekeeping operation, you can find a number of instances where the peacekeeping missions or the senior mission leaders either adhere to the norms as they interpreted. Finally, it impacted on the performance of the peacekeeping operations. And this is one part that is, and if you want me to continue, I can continue, or I can do it later. This is the first part. And okay, do I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, let me finish the consent part. This is a very important. The consent, actually that consent at strategic level, operational level, tactical level, will rarely be absolute. So consent normally is given out of compulsion, maybe in return of some incentive by the international community. Therefore, what happened, consent is always conditional. Now, these conditions cannot be defined. So you do not know how to define the consent. What happened, these conditions, many a times not reduced into writing, are diluted. The consent is withdrawn by the parties to the conflict. And the consent is withdrawn, that what happened, actually, there could be a different kind of implication. For instance, I'll give you an example. You talked of Cambodia. In Cambodia, consent was available at strategic level, but the tactical level, at some place at Khmer Rouge, the consent was withdrawn. Because what happened, that in armed groups, which are unlike a regular military army, number of groups are there. The orders and instructions that come out at the top need not be percolated similarly at the executionable level. That is one. There are instances, Cambodia was an instance when consent was present at a strategic level, at a tactical level, it was withdrawn once in a while.
Also, the strength of the soldiers, I understand that there was a Portuguese contingent there for the peacekeeping, and they did not have clear orders, and also the number was way too less to contain the entire situation as given, and the situation very aggressively escalated for them to do anything on it.
You are correct, yes or no, both. There are instances that number of troops are very less, that they may not be able to execute. But there are also instances, for example, Bosnia, I will let you know later, the small group of maybe of 100 odd people, or the platoon size 30 odd people, could withstand indirect fire from the Croat battalion for about 24 hours. So it is actually more than the troop strength, it is about the will, a political will, and the will of the peacekeepers, commandos on ground. How do they want to implement the mandate? So it is true. If you want to give the excuses, you can always give the excuses. On opposite example, I can give in Bosnia, when the genocide, almost you can call it genocide, 11 July 1995, when these Maldives, the Serb attacked one of the these safe areas and took 50 Dutch peacekeepers as hostages. The mission had all the power in the hand, and they could have called NATO airstrike. They had the power, but did not do it for a number of reasons. Like Yasusi Akasi was the head of the mission, and Genevieve was a French general, was the all-force commander in Bosnia. They thought that while discussion was political, dialogue was going on between Milosevic and Holbrooke, that maybe if they use force against the Serb military, maybe they will derail the process. Or if they use the power, the airstrike against the Serbs, what could have happened, that maybe they will, the Serbs will be more enraged, they anger them more, and they may retaliate more badly. So they took a decision not to use the fire. Or some people say they were obsessed with adhering to the principles of peacekeeping, non-use of force, or impartiality, as they interpret principle of principality or the consent. And people say that they deliberately delayed it. There are a report from the human rights report that deliberately delayed calling the airstrike. If the airstrike had come well on time, I think history of Bosnia would have been different.
It was anti of it, and they failed the charter. I would like to come to Ambassador Srivastava sir here. Sir, again, against the principles or with the principles, and adhering to all the mandate and the charter and everything, could you take us through the plausible areas of discussion for this discussion, that what the decision making is, where these shortcomings may slip through the cracks, and how do they show up as inefficiencies of the missions and subsequent facets of mission planning that are not considered you know, taking into consideration the military angle, the political angle, so on and so forth. And can you take us through the process of conflict identification, vote in the UNSC that warrants the UN peacekeeping operations in the region, and how is the mission charter mandated with these success criteria of that mission to not fail?
Okay. Thank you, Vipul. Before I address these specific issues, which are very important, let me point out some fundamental differences between UN peacekeeping and national wars. This is for our audience to understand. National wars have a narrow focus. UN peacekeepings are mandated by world body based on the UN Charter. The objective is not to win the war, but to maintain peace. Now, this is a fundamental difference. Now, the second aspect, that the success and failures of the UN are also success and failures of the member states, because UN is an intergovernmental body. Now, this is something which has to be borne in mind, because often UN is made the fall guy when a peacekeeping operation goes wrong. What is forgotten is that behind its failure, or for that matter success, lies the political will, which includes political will of the members, of the 5 permanent members, first of all, and the general membership, and the resources provided. Third aspect that has to be kept in mind is that UN peacekeeping is perhaps the most cost-effective solution. You compare this with the operations undertaken by what I call regional arrangements. Regional arrangements are NATO. In the past, it was Warsaw Pact. Now you have, Russian-led CSTO and so on. They tend to be, we have the example of Iraq War, 2003 onwards, and we have the example of Afghanistan War. They tend to be extremely costly in men and material. As compared to that, UN operations are virtually conducted on a shoestring and have brought peace and led and helped emergence of nation states. I'll give you 3 examples. Cambodia, which General Bardalai also mentioned in 93. UN held the elections and made possible the transition to a democratic country. Namibia, a little earlier, Namibia's transition from a South African colony to an independent state, and again it was led by a UN operation. And Mozambique, ONUMUS. So these were success stories which are often forgotten but have to be kept in mind. Now let me come to the issue of ambiguities in principles. Let me bring in the 4th point, and that is the success or failure is not limited to the 3 principles. Principles are fine. It is a mandate set by the UN Security Council and the resources provided for the mandate. And though that mandate is always a result of a compromise. And compromise means often absence of a single focus, which leads to other problems. I'll give you an example so that it becomes clear. And these problems, let me give you an example. Some of the most well-known operations in the 90s were Somalia, Rwanda. They didn't quite succeed. But if you look at what happened in Somalia, the UN went in after US-led operation had already taken place. Mm-hmm. Now that for a large extent, was responsible for the difficulties which UNOSOM 2 had to face, because by that time, UNOSOM 1 and UNOSOM 1 had already cleared the pitch. There was large-scale violence. UN withdrew, and as somebody put it, US withdrew, and UN was sent in to take care of a worsening situation.
Sir, so basically to add here, what the where the discontinuity of the operations happened was the US forces went in first to capture Mohammed Aidi, right? And the war already broke out, which could have been contained with UN going in first. So that was a matter of, disconnect right there. And US had heavy casualties, and that's the reason why they had to move out and were not able to wait for the UN forces to, get in. And then it was a very bloody situation to contain in the first place, right?
Yes. So the violence had already taken place.
Yep.
And UN went in not in the sense of a traditional peacekeeping. There was no peace, and there was no consent, because there was no government, and the dominant faction, that is headed by General Aidid, had been, because of the actions taken by UNOSOM 1, which was a multilateral force, was on the other side of the fence. Now, the second aspect, and this happens sometime, this is very curious, and it is often not brought out, especially by Western commentators. India, Pakistan, a number of other developing countries were asked to shoulder the burden of UNOSOM 2. We went in, we sent a strong contingent. After our contingent had reached there and UNOSOM had started its operations, the mandate was changed. It was the original mandate included forcible disarmament, which required a Chapter 7 operation. And Chapter 7 operation, for our audience, let me clarify, means an operation which is not based, which is not necessarily based on consent. So if you are taking action against somebody without consent, it requires, enforcement, and there's higher level of violence. Now, forcible disarmament, which led to increase in war, because the combatants don't want to be disarmed. Certainly the Chapter 7 was withdrawn. This was towards sometime around 94, late 94, early 95. Now, this changed the complexion of the operation, but this change in the mandate set by the Security Council, or mandate changed by the Security Council, did not percolate down to the ground, because the rules of engagement were not changed. Now, this created a situation where the contingent on the ground was still fighting the old rules of engagement, which included enforced disarmament, while the Security Council had actually withdrawn that mandate. Now, this is a major ambiguity, but this, I would say, it actually goes beyond the issue of ambiguity. Now, failure of the UNOSOM 2 operation created a kind of caution. So when the Rwanda trouble broke out, there was hesitation to go in, and which led to the initial massacre. And then UN was sent in, and we were, of course, part of that operation also, and we helped stabilize the situation. Now, these are complexities which flow not so much from the three principles which we discussed earlier. These follow from the political context and the mandate set by the Security Council. And the examples which I gave you, these are examples of operations which involved use of military force for enforcement, Chapter 7, which are different from the traditional peacekeeping. Now, let me take you to fast forward to Sierra Leone, and I had something to do with Indian participation. I was Joint Secretary UN and MEA. The Sierra Leone operation in '99, it started with a peacekeeping operation. It was based on Lome Accord between the rebels and the government. Once the UN started deploying, that unfortunately that accord broke down. So the political context changed. Now, in the absence of accord, the level of military force needed goes up. Now that adjustment took time. So though the ground reality had changed from a situation where there was a agreement between the rebels and the government, to a situation where there was, the RUF had walked out, and RUF had walked out because RUF chief Fode Sanko was arrested. Now this brings me to the, I was talking about the internal contradictions of the mandate. If you are basing an operation on consent of the parties, then you cannot start, operations against one party, which will lead to withdrawal and of that consent, which is what happened. And the impact was felt by the UN operation because we had a force commander from our side, and the force level took time to build up, but the situation did not wait for that. And that led to a situation which ended with 500 UN peacekeepers from 13 different countries taken hostages. And I was involved in that part of the drama to get some of them released through negotiations. But that goes beyond our discussion today. So that's for some other day.
Sir, so basically, that you were talking about the internal conflict of the mandate. So, and you took up the UNISOM instance, wherein the UNISOM was not even in Mogadishu. It was still on the outskirts of Mogadishu, way before the UN forces, the US forces had already started their operation. So this lack of coordination cost a lot. Rather than it being a coordinated strike, it would have been all the more effective. And this ambiguity has actually significant implications for efforts to measure, and it can be improved in terms of peacekeeping performance, like the one observed from functional and strategic parameters in the instance where General Bipin Rawat took charge of the MONUSCO mission in Congo in 2008, and things weren't going too well for the world's costliest peacekeeping mission at that time. And before he took charge, the peacekeeping were struggling to contain the crisis in Congo, formerly known as the Zaire. He authorized the use of force in some scenarios as mandated by Chapter 7, like you mentioned some time back, and reworking the velvet glove strategy to an iron fist within a month of his arrival. The strategy involved redrafting the strategy and authorizing heavy usage of attack helicopters and infantry combat vehicles, rigged with machine guns and cannons to repeatedly hit hot pockets of the rebel-held areas where the violations were reported. That is the civilian deaths, the recruiting of child soldiers, and displacing millions of people. So, General Bardalai, sir, like this example, what we are seeing here, what are the powers of the force commander of the operation to override or to reconstruct, restructure the mission under command, and to what extent?
Okay, Vipul, before I answer that question, can I go back to or add on to what Ambassador Srivastava had mentioned?
Sure.
But these are connected issues. Like very rightly, Ambassador Srivastava mentioned that principles, there's nothing wrong in the principles. Principles are absolutely good and clear cut. That's why it is considered as one of the success factors which mentioned in even published book in 2008, Principles and Guidelines, my first success factor. But having said that, since I mentioned earlier that they're slightly ambiguous in nature, they get connected to mandate also. To give you an example, going back to what again Ambassador Srivastava mentioned, going back to Somalia, what had happened was, given there's no effective government, and if you want to take consent from whom do you want to take the consent from? Two rival leaders, one is Al-Mahidi and secondly Muhammad Aidid. The then Secretary General was Muhammad Sanoun. He was an Algerian diplomat, and the country was going through difficult times, shortage of food, people are dying, and everybody wanted humanitarian aid. So Muhammad Sanoun could convince Al-Mahdi, but it was difficult to convince Muhammad Aidid, who also finally agreed for 500 military observers to escort the humanitarian convoys. He agreed. That is the first that even would have gone in there. But while this proposal was made, then Secretary General Butros Ghali, he proposed to the Security Council for 3,000 peacekeepers without consulting either Muhammad Sanoun or Muhammad General Aidid. So Aidid considered as the breach of faith. So he recanted his consent, what he had given, and thereafter it became a history. Pakistani troops have gone, inspected, 24 Pakistani soldiers died. And then Jonathan Howe was the admiral there, US force. Then they ordered, the peace process could have been still salvaged until they used, the Cobra helicopters and 20 cannons on the so-called alleged meeting of these gang leaders. And some people were killed at a point-blank range. And it was, for the Somalis are concerned, Bloody Monday. And finally, what had happened was, that when US Rangers went there, you would have seen that movie Black Hawk Down. So then it became history. It had cascading effect on this thing, Rwanda. That is how it gets connected to consent, and when the consent is withdrawn, what happens? So nothing is wrong with the consent principle, but what implications? Coming to Rwanda, the peace agreement was signed, Arusha peace agreement, and the parties has given consent. They actually committed that UN is a good broker for a ceasefire agreement. But what was unknown before the genocide had taken place to anyone, the Hutu power center had emerged, the only Hutu. So they were working and nobody knew about it. And it only required an incident like on 6th April 1994, when Rwandan President Havyarimana died in an air crash. Then the genocide took place. Thereafter, it was like a mandate, like just Ambassador Srivastava brought out. Firstly, nobody is going to accept it as a genocide. So finally, a lot of after persuasion, so many people died. They agreed, but mandate again, they will mandate weak mandate, but troops will not come forward. So this is one of the cases. Now coming back to that, I thought I'll clarify that. Coming back to your question about that, the rules of engagement are drafted and approved at the headquarter level, that is UN headquarter, New York. Now, these are general guidelines to be followed by the field commanders on ground. There could be a lot of implications. Now, field commanders, now, if you question that, now again they come back to the principles of peacekeeping. Now, what is the meaning of self-defense? You are allowed to use force in self-defense, but what is the meaning of self-defense? Is it self-defense means, for example, protecting UN personnel, or protecting UN mandate, or protecting UN bases? Or how do you interpret this word, use of minimum force in self-defense? How much is minimum? Can you quantify? It's very difficult. Different interpretation will come to. For instance,
Sir, so what is the authorized force under Chapter 7?
no, again, I'm coming to that. I'll come to that way. You see, like Chapter 6 authorizes use of force. Normally, it is a misunderstanding that force can be used only under Chapter 7. It is wrong. Force can be used even under Chapter 6 for self-defense. But Hammarskjöld, when he gave the report, 2-3 things came out. First, use of force under Chapter 6, use of force under Chapter 7, but also under Chapter 6. The line between use of force in a Chapter 6 operation for self-defense and combat operation is very blurred. For instance, in Congo, ONOP, it was a Chapter 6 mission, but they used the phrases like use necessary means. It was an all-out combat when by the time 1964, Indian contingent had participated. The line was very blurry. Now, second part is that when he used under, there's some of the phrases came in, like robust peacekeeping, aggressive peacekeeping, use all necessary means. Now, it has further compounded the understanding of the peacekeeping principles of use of force and created confusions. Now, for example, robust peacekeeping is written down in US principle book. Robust peacekeeping means the mission is robust. It can use force at tactical level with the consent of the host government. It is very difficult. I do not know what circumstances host government will give the permit. If they give the permission, now it can get into the turf of the principle of the impartiality. Second thing, robust peacekeeping, use of aggressive peacekeeping, use of all forces are normally understood to be associated with Chapter 7. But again, adding on to building up on what Ambassador Srivastava said in the mandate, there are times there are mandates are, even after Chapter 6, use of phrases like use all necessary means. Their peacekeeping missions under Chapter 7, these lines are missing. So it creates confusions in the peacekeeper's mind and the confusion in the member states' mind to contributing countries, because inside our own countries, it may be easier for us to do damage control, but outside, everybody looking at each other is very difficult. So some of the countries and also know that whenever use excessive force or use force are likely to be retaliated. When the force is retaliated by rebel groups, bound to be casualties and becomes very difficult. No troop contributing countries want the casualty to their own peacekeepers that they have to answer. So therefore, when you, like what you said, how much the field commanders can translate, like I said, no head of the mission will give you clear-cut orders. If they will say this is the mandate, so how do you interpret this? At the same time, force commanders, technically speaking, all the military contingents come under the force commander. If the force commanders say you do that, technically speaking, they're supposed to do that. But the military contingents may or may not do it because they're caveats from the own country. Regular basis, every contingent remains in touch with their home country. They do that, don't do it. Like for example, in Rwanda, when the genocide took place, then force commander Brigadier General Romeo Dallaire, when he went out of his way with a handful of observers to save as many people, even a contingent, military contingent, stood by as a mute spectator with whatever happened. They possibly thought the either looking for the home country, what instructions what is to be done, or possibly they thought that not doing anything, remaining neutral. So there's a confusion between neutrality and impartiality dilemma. But this only not the people what they think. Even our event documents, the Capstone Doctrine talks of impartiality, but the Brahmi report talks of impartiality stroke neutrality. So many confusions, the people take advantage of this ambiguity, and when it comes to mandate implementation, and mandate itself are politically compromised, as you say. So finally, it impact on the peacekeeping performance. Like what I said, give an example. One contingent in Rwanda did not act. In Indian contingents in South Sudan, I will not talk of Congo because you mentioned about that. In 2013, but more than 20,000 civilian population ran away to reach nearest base, even base camps. So even base camp ended up sheltering about more than 20 or 1,000 this thing internally displaced personnel. Initial orders were that gates are not to be open, but some of the peacekeeping contingent, they said, no, we'll open the gates, purely out of humanitarian consideration. So they ended up giving, I think, and for this, there are scholars, observers, they have applauded our Indian contingents. The same South Sudan, 2016, when the government force raided Terrain Hotel, which was housing lot of even civilian employees, they got them out of the rooms. Firstly, they shot that John Gatlock. He was an independent reporter. In presence of everyone, they took out the women, mostly Western, raped them, abused them, and continuous pleading from these people to even camp nearby for help did not materialize. Now there are several stories or reasons why they could not come, or some of the peacekeeping contingents, maybe they had their own strategic interest in South Sudan, oil interest. I don't want to name that contingent. They deliberately did not react. It's a matter of time. I mean, I leave it to a conjecture why did not report. But eventually what had happened where the force commander was sacked. So there are number of how much the force commander can do it, how much contingents commander can, this all up to him.
So basically on the ground analysis, and then the force commander's resources at hand and the prerogative that he has to take the pertinent decision at that time. So Ambassador Srivastava sir, what are the powers and the liberties now that General Bardalai was talking about? Again, the core political consideration from the parent nation. So what are the powers and liberties of an individual country and the peacekeeping mandate given to bring about the rapid turnaround, and what possible normative ambiguities there could come fundamentally at the deployment level that can come in between employing these strategies to arrive at the status quo ante?
Let me clarify one thing. General Bardalai has given a very interesting and lucid description of a very wide canvas. What I want to distill from what he has said is that he was mentioning that the national contingents often do not follow the orders of the force commander because they are in touch with their home governments. Now, this is a fact of life. We know it, but this is not condoned by UN, principles or UN Security Council resolutions. Once you are deployed, you have to follow the mandate laid down by the UN Security Council. What can an individual country or which is heading that, which probably has contributed a large contingent, what can they do for bringing a quick turnaround? I think this is a chimera. These are conflicts rooted in a lot of very complex situations, You just look at the history of Congo operation. India went in the operation was started by Dag Hammarskjöld, and the UN Secretary General, and he lost his life in that operation. Now that was early 60s. And half a century later, the operation is still going on. So to expect a quick end to a conflict situation is difficult. Now, this is not something limited only to UN operations. You take Afghanistan. The UN did not go into Afghanistan. It was the two superpowers who went in turn. First, the Soviet Union during Cold War, and after 9/11, it was America. And after half a century of conflict, starting in 78 or 79, that country, that situation has still not been resolved. Now, so it is better to be patient. And this brings out the importance of the three principles enunciated by Dag Hammarskjöld. Without impartiality, combatants, or UN itself becomes a combatant or is seen as a belligerent by the local parties. So it is very important for UN to maintain its role as an impartial force. Now, there have been deviations. One of the principles, it was an unwritten convention that permanent members will not take part in UN peacekeeping operations. Now that has been breached. A particular neighbor that we have, and we have a problem with that neighbor, which happens to be a permanent member, is now increasing its presence in the UN peacekeeping operations. This does not necessarily mean that it's increasing support to UN. It simply means it is, pushing forward its own agenda. So what is the way forward? Now, way forward, how sacrosanct these three principles are, or we have to think in terms of revising them. General Bardalai mentioned concepts like robust peacekeeping and aggressive peacekeeping. I frankly am very uncomfortable with these concepts because unless they are built into the Security Council mandate, they have no legitimacy. You cannot have a Chapter 6 operation and then conduct it as a peace enforcement or Chapter 7 operation in the guise of robust peacekeeping. So it's become a fashionable term, but in itself, it is laying ground for ambiguities. It creates an ambiguity. It starts with an ambiguity, and it leads to an upward spiral of violence because you use more violence, and there will be a reaction. Now, a broad point. The UN has gone through 2 or 3 different stages, 3 stages broadly. This was Cold War, which lasted till the 90s, where the UN operations were few and far between with limited mandates. Then came post-Cold War, which was period started in early 90s, and there was an upsurge in these operations. Now that enthusiasm has waned. And now we are entering into the third phase where the post-Cold War collegiality of permanent members, what made it possible in the 90s to undertake more ambitious operations was that the America and Russia, the 2 superpowers, members of veto-wielding members of the Security Council, were on the same page. Now that collegiality is gone. There's a rift now. So we are now, the clock is turning back. What it translates into situation on the ground is that there is less support for UN operations, especially those which involve large or escalating violence. Now, let me add one last point here. for national aims, public at home is willing to accept sacrifices. But, you know, if some soldier is dying in a distant land where prima facie your country has no national interest, and that is the very built into the very nature of UN operations and the principle of impartiality. The appetite for accepting sacrifices is that much less. And which is what happened in the 90s when the Americans, US President Clinton decided to withdraw from Somalia. And he came up with this famous statement, you know, we are not there for nation building. And that happens with the, you know, I've faced the situation as on the spot or at the headquarters, you know, questions from the press and the parliament. If some Indian peacekeepers are taken hostage, it happened. It happened in Angola. It happened in Sierra Leone. What interest do we have now? So we have to bear in mind these essential, these fundamental realities in deciding the mandate of the operation and how that mandate is translated into action on the ground.
So the statement that we are not here for nation building has come from US on multiple occasions. We have heard the same statement in terms of Afghanistan also. And coming so from there, coming to the principles that we were talking about.
And if I may just interrupt and see that it was a Democrat, President Clinton, who said that we are not here for nation building. This was Somalia, and he issued that famous Presidential Directive 25. And almost 25 years later, it was a Republican president who said that we are not here for nation building. This was Mr. Trump in Afghanistan. So it underlines the importance of recognizing limits of political support, without which no operation can be continued.
That also explains the mentality behind vetoes against any action from US all these years. But coming back to the principles, right? We've been talking about the principles. So coming back to the principles of UN peacekeeping is that, disarmament and international security, economic and financials, social and humanitarian and cultural stability, special political and decolonization efforts, administrative and budgetary, the legal, and and on the same lines. So generally, the Security Council provides any authorized UN intervention with mandate that sets out the task that the operation is to undertake while it is deployed. The mandate is the platform on which each UN peace operation is based. So again, Ambassador Srivastava sir, what are the rights and provisions in the overall UNSC charter that allows the deployed nations forces or homogenized forces to discharge their services in the expected manner, and what reforms are needed to be brought to make the process simple to eliminate these normative discrepancies to meet that expected manner?
Vipul, let me take you back to the initial observation made by General Bardalai that UN peacekeeping was not part of the UN Charter. It evolved as a result of practice, and that is why it was jokingly called Chapter 6.5. Chapter 6 deals with peaceful resolution, peaceful settlement of disputes, and Chapter 7 deals with sanctions and peace enforcement action. This was somewhere in between, where you are not doing peace enforcement, but you are keeping peace, which has been arrived at. But then the spectrum was expanded to include also peace enforcement within the mandate of UN operations. Now, the irony is, and this goes back to the superpower rivalry, that the tool which was mandated in the charter to take care of these situations. This is the military staff committee. That committee was formed, but there was great reluctance to allow UN a standing army, because that would have cut into the leeway of enjoyed by the powers that be. So that disconnect between what is written on the charter. There, the charter talks about, since you mentioned this is a very interesting part, plans for Article 43 onwards, that Article 43 says of the charter, all members of the UN, in order to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, undertake to make available to the Security Council on its call and in accordance with a special agreement or agreements, armed forces assistance and facilities, including rights of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Now, there is chapters, Article 43, and then there are 44, 45, 46, which laid down a certain, drill to be followed, which never went beyond formation of a military staff committee that called for force. It remained an ad hoc thing. Now, this was sought to be remedied by Mr. Butros Ghali, who was UN Secretary General in the 90s. He had the advantage of assuming the reins of the UN just after the Cold War had ended, when there was more political support from both sides of the divide. And he suggested a standing army, which was not accepted by the General Assembly. So we are back to a situation where UN has to deal with a situation on ad hoc basis as it develops. It first, if there's a conflict situation, it will send an envoy who will come back and report. On that basis, the Security Council will meet and then adopt a resolution, and then the UN Secretariat or the Secretary General will ask individual member states for their contribution. So this whole process gets stressed on. I don't think under the present circumstances, because as I was saying, that we are now at that juncture of history where the clock is turning back, and that P5 collegiate, which was the basis for more and ambitious peacekeeping in the 90s, that has broken down. So we are back to the earlier phase. And in fact, before I conclude, let me mention something which probably we should have brought out right in the beginning. UN peacekeeping is not limited to actions or decisions of Security Council. In fact, it's the other way around. UN peacekeeping started with the actions and decisions of the UN General Assembly. It was a famous Uniting for Peace resolution in case of Korean War in the 50s, where there was a deadlock in the Security Council, and US and its allies transferred the discussions to the General Assembly, which decided to, gave the authorization. And much later, in the 50s, the same thing happened with UNF in Sinai. It was authorized by the General Assembly in the absence of any decision in the Security Council because of threat of the Soviet veto at that time. So we have to bear in mind these political complexities, which lay down the range within which the peacekeeping operation has to be conducted.
So basically, your answer takes me to John Mersheimer's Great Power Politics, and where each great power is on its own agenda, whether it's while working in a unison or not working in a unison with the UN peacekeeping or not at that time, and which also translates into bringing the normative discrepancy here. So extrapolating that, so General Bardalai sir, what can you name, in your opinion, as the prime factors for failures of the UN mission? And where does the world draw a line to operational incompetencies of UN to bring justice to its own charter in whatever regions that they are operating? So this could be your summarizing kind of a statement.
No, then I will have to go back to what initially first, what Ambassador Srivastava had mentioned. UN is what the member states make out of it. That is one. Then second is the politics. You see, it is not that reform has not taken place. UN has initiated a number of steps in reforming the peacekeeping operations. And reform has taken place, albeit slowly. You know, a number of reports have come out, political primacy, troops have become stronger, they're well-trained, better equipped. Even mandates have become much stronger than what it was earlier. There's no doubt about it. But unfortunately, what happened, entire decision-making process takes place in New York and in the hands of the P5 countries. And it's interesting to know, when the mandate formulation takes place, like what Ambassador had mentioned about the political compromise, normally one of the three countries, France, UK, and USA, depending on which area and how it suits them, they take the lead in formulating the mandate. They call it the pen holder system. And they formulate the mandate. First, they circulate only among the first P5 countries, work around, drafting, redrafting take place, compromises are made. Then after that, they circulate to the 10 remaining members. So finally, what comes out of the Security Council approved is as a compromise mandate, which you cannot help. Second, like earlier when it was decided that only P5 nations will not take part in peacekeeping missions, those days one never thought of actually intrastate conflict. Now the intrastate conflict, as it is seen, number of rebel groups, proliferation of arms, and it really requires capable and well-trained troops. And generally these are available with a few nations in the global south, mostly with a lot of developed nations. But the developed nations also do not take part unless it suits them. I think Lebanon is the only place where Italy, Spain, and France are taking place. And France is participating and leading the peacekeeping mission actually in Mali, because it suits them strategically. So when you look at it, peacekeeping will remain as it is. And member states, I think, like earlier, Ambassador Srivastava will remember, I think during your time, during the Sierra Leone mission, the first time that the troop contributing countries in a peacekeeping missions, the chief of the troop, army of the troop contribution participated in peacekeeping, in a discussion in UN headquarters. You know, we had been voicing their opinion that you want us to participate in peacekeeping operation. You formulate the mandate in New York, but we have to deal it, so you must take us on board. So I would say the reform is taking place, but slowly and slowly. Given that given the way that conflict is taking place, like one of the countries, I know Ambassador Srivastava is meaning China. I don't want to, everybody knows that China is taking part, taking more and more interest. And very gradually, China is going to stake claim for head of the mission and force commander slowly and slowly. They have their own interest. And today, China and Russia is more or less aligned on the other side. Now, at different plane, all the P5 countries join together, join hands when it suits them individually. Now, given that, I think I don't see any other alternative, better alternative than even peacekeeping operations when it comes to bring back peace in a conflict area. Until then, I think peacekeeping operation will remain as in the mainstream for in the conflict management wherever UN is involved. At the same time, if there is a political will, the member states are interested, troops are well trained and well equipped, and mandate becomes stronger, I think time will come that I think track record of even peacekeeping operations in making positive contribution will only improve. I am not very pessimist about it. I'll take some time.
Fantastic. So, the ambassador had said some time back that the objective is not to win a war, but to maintain peace. But then if in itself, if there is no peace to start with, then reaching the status quo ante, come what may, in whatever means can't be achieved, will take more measures and more deliberation to reach there. So what we can gather from our conversation today is that peacekeeping should be used as a part of political solution and not as an alternative. The problem is that the Security Council is a political body, meaning that the operations are sometimes used as alternative to a political solution and deployed into the places where there is actually no peace to keep. So this is because the council wants to be seen to be doing something. The deployment of a peace operation is all too often that then something, right? So again, coming back to the same notion, that idea of peace in the area is just an idea and no status quo ante for the world to see more blunders to see.
Going forward, the way is first we have to consider reform of the UN Security Council. This present structure is rooted in the realities of post-Second World War, and that requires, unless that is changed, there will not be sufficient support for actions at the Security Council, which is reflected in a succession of failures it has faced. The second is that there has to be more transparency, as General Bardalai was mentioning, the consultation with two contributing countries. Now, this has to be broadened, especially when the mandate is being changed. At that time, again, the two contributing countries must be consulted. And the third and the last point, what is the alternative? If nothing else, if you consider all other alternatives, the three principles of UN peacekeeping are perhaps the best bet that we have. Or a larger issue, that if you do not have UN peacekeeping and it is left to unilateral intervention by powers that be, that will be much worse than what we witness when an individual operation does not go as well as it was supposed to be. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much to come to Diplomacy Direct to share your transparent views on this topic that is actually never ending and is always on, or is at least supposed to be on, a course correction. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Srivastava. Thank you, Vipul.
Thank you,
General Sir.
And thank you, Vipul.